A very warm welcome to all of you. In today's class, we are going to look at the social costs of migration. So, as you may remember in the previous class, we looked at the specific concept of emotions and we looked at emotions in migration research. And so there we saw how the concept of emotions is quite complex and more often than not, emotions are not incorporated in migration research. And though, however, this is somewhat changing now, there has been an emotions turn in migration. And we also saw how adding the lens of emotions adds to our understanding and perspective, and it gives more nuance to our analysis. Now, in this class, we are moving on to the social costs of migration. And so, the broader discussion on social costs is somewhat different from the very narrow discussion we had on emotions in the previous class, right? So, in this class, we are going to look at the broader discussion on social costs of migration. We will talk about the impacts of migration, and I want you to think of impacts more widely. And if we look at impacts more widely, we then also are in a better position to engage with the social costs of migration, which often, like the emotions of migration, are invisibilized. So, therefore, you will see unless we change our paradigms and our perspectives, we will bypass, we will not truly understand the social cost of migration. So, now I want you to shift your gaze to the social cost of migration. So, there are many ways of looking at social costs. One is that you can disaggregate migration by stream, right? So, you have international migration, you have national migration or internal migration. Both of these have social costs, right? In international migration, you have social costs related to mobility restrictions, visa barriers, and so on. In national or internal streams, you have social costs related to the fact that a lot of migration is exclusionary, family separation is a fundamental feature of both internal and international migration. So, in internal migration, even though we do not have any mobility restrictions, most countries do not have mobility restrictions, and in India, we have our constitution which guarantees the freedom of mobility. But however, there are still a lot of restrictions, and these are economic restrictions. Migrants can't afford to bring their families to the cities and so on, right? So, those are huge social costs. So, each stream, whether we look at national, international, internal, and so on, each stream has distinct social costs, and there are also some social costs which might overlap between the two streams, right? Another way of looking at social costs is to look at them through the various units of analysis, right? So, now you have individuals in source region, in destination region, which is, you have migrants themselves and you have those who are left behind. Now, what about migrants themselves, right? So, typically, the literature shows us that, when migrants go to a new destination, when they experience a new destination, they're away from their families, they are mostly alone, they often experience loneliness, social isolation, even discrimination, right? What about those individuals who are left behind? These are largely family members, and so in male-dominated migration streams, it's the women who generally bear burdens of migration. Migration impacts women fundamentally and phenomenally, and women take care of the families and farms, they need to take care of livestock. Also, in case of agrarian households, women often oversee farming. They have to hire in labor, they have to make payments, they have to go to markets. All of these are new tasks, new tasks that are added to women's work. So, migration of men adds to the burden of women greatly. Of course, it also leads to their increased mobility. There are studies that show that it leads to their increased empowerment. But so these are, there are multiple impacts of migration. And when we engage with the multiple impacts, then we are in a better position to then talk about the social cost, right? The other thing that women really are burdened with is responsibilities of care and social reproduction. They have to care for children and elderly in the context of male-dominated migration streams. Then you also have the community. Now, community life suffers tremendously when young people are away, when migrants are away. And if we look at villages and towns from where there has been mass migration, from where there's been an exodus of workers or exodus of people, we find that there is a hollowing out of life in source regions due to migration. And then, of course, there are implications for states. So you have high migration states like Bihar, where you have a significant proportion of the male workforce that has migrated for work. So you have a paradox, right? The paradox is that they migrate for higher incomes, for development, and so on. But there's a brain drain. There's also a brawn drain, and then because of which the state really suffers. And such high levels of migration then also contribute to negative outcomes, and the state is unable to really take off and develop. Similarly, take the case of Kerala in India. So Kerala has had migration for several generations now, and much of the migration is international migration. Remittances are a key source of development in the state. But you also have a problem where, as we saw in the Kerala migration study lecture by Professor Iridya Rajan, you also have a problem where you have elderly left behind, women left behind. A lot of care and social reproduction is sort of borne unevenly by those who are left behind. Then you have nation states, countries. There are countries from where migration is very high. So, countries like Philippines, countries like Mexico, the national development trajectories in these states are marked by high migration. So, and all of these units of analysis bear the costs of migration in very many ways. So, let us first look at the impact of migration on women left behind, right? So, there have been many studies globally, and I'm taking you through some of the results of these empirical studies. So, in a study in China, it was evident that left behind women suffer what Ye calls 3 big mountains. So, the main tasks, the main big mountains, or the main hurdles that they suffer are heavy workloads. That's the first. Overwhelming mental stress, that's the second. Again, you can see very closely linked to the emotions of migration. And a sense of isolation and insecurity that stems from having to deal with farming, child raising, and care for the elderly alone. Similarly, Liu in another study finds that in male-dominated migration streams, in the absence of their fathers, children develop deep emotional bonds with their mothers, while developing feelings of ambivalence towards their fathers. So you see, so mothers therefore have to step up in the role of parenting, and the absence of parents, be it mother, be it father, have severe impacts on children. And that's also one of the major social costs of migration, and we're going to come to that in a little while. In another study in Indonesia, Somaya et al. Urged us to think about the social and economic cost of migration. And largely, women anchor the household beyond care, beyond social reproduction. Whereas in the literature, very often they are seen as passive recipients of male migration. So, again, when we're looking at impacts, right? When we're looking at impacts, very often the literature looks at women as simply passive recipients of male migration. However, we are trying to get a sense of the impacts of migration in women. And when we shift our gaze to this, we find how their work burdens have increased, how their care responsibilities have increased, and so on. Now coming to, a little bit to gender. So, like you've seen in the course how some streams of migration can be male-dominated, other streams of migration can be female-dominated. Now, in masculinized migration streams, we find that the male breadwinner model is amplified. So, men have to chin up and migrate to support their families, as care and social reproduction is placed solely on the women, right? So, we can see migration streams are gendered, and when men tend to migrate, women have to share the burden. Similarly, when women migrate, then there are feelings of guilt, there are feelings of being an absent parent, and so on. And children then grow without their mothers. And that also has a huge social cost, as we will see later. So what about the impact of migration on children? Just as we saw that women are not passive recipients of male migration, children also are not passive recipients, but they are active agents that demand and deserve attention in their own right. And we haven't really studied children in migration unless you specifically look at children, purposively study them. You will not have data, and then children are invisibilized in migration research. So it's a fact that children's childhoods and their lives are shaped by their family migration projects, right? So now researchers who have done studies with children, they find that children have deep, intense, messy, complex feelings about their parents' migration that cannot be put in the binaries of cost, benefits, and their trade-offs, right? So while children don't have a say in their parents' migration, for many children, the absence of their parents is devastating at a core emotional level. So, there are contexts where you have male migration, so children live without their fathers, where you have female migration, so children live without their mothers. But there are also parental migration situations, right, where children live without both mothers and fathers. And all of these situations are unique, and all of these situations then have different ramifications on children, right? So Harriet Beasley and her colleagues in a study in Indonesia find that in high migration villages, child rearing is very difficult, and those who are left behind find it difficult to provide care for children. And for many children, the loneliness, the pain and emotional toll of their parents' migration far outweighs the material gains of migration. And Liu, in another study in the context of China, foregrounds structural inequalities that compel this migration and subsequent family separations, which again cause immense social and psychological toll and adversely affect the well-being of children. So when we look at children, of course, every unit of analysis is important, right? So children's own feelings, their own experiences of their parents' migration, but also the family context. What is the situation in which the family is migrating? And then, of course, what is the context of the source region? What is the context of the rural areas? This is fundamental in understanding why migration is happening, right? So again, what are the drivers of migration? What are the causes of migration? How do they speak to the impacts and social causes of migration? These are some of the things that we really need to look at a broad level to be able to understand the impacts and social causes of migration. Now, so you have other Chinese studies that show that the high costs left behind children pay for the families and states' migration projects. So really fundamentally, whose project is this? Clearly, the children don't desire that their parents migrate. And of course, parents migrate fundamentally so that they can give a better life to their children. So the project of migration is a family project, but it's also the state's project, right? The state is mediating the kind of development, the state is facilitating the kind of development for which you need migrant labor. It's also the project of capital, right? Our cities, our projects of urbanization, our process of development are happening in such a manner that they need cheap labor. And they need labor in such a way that labor is unable to bring their families to destination. Men and women, working men and women are unable to make meaningful lives at destination, and family separation is a part of it. And we are going to discuss more of this. So in the whole process, children are largely invisibilized, and their experiences, their experiences don't really matter, are not factored in. And studies very clearly show the deep impact of parental absence on children. And this is mostly negative. What are the impacts? So there's increased workload, there's little study, tutoring, supervision, and most importantly, the unmet needs of parental affection. So just like women, left behind children too have to shoulder heavy labor burdens, whether it's housework, whether it's farm work, care work, and they're also at the risk of psychological problems. And while children feel lonely, while children feel lost, they suffer tremendous hardships, they don't complain very often because they are deeply aware of the economic benefits that migration brings to the family. They're deeply aware that migration is a family project. So then they just sort of suck it up and take it in. Now, Rachel Murphy, in her work with children in Eastern China, shows that left behind children are contingent, shows that the views about left behind children are contingent upon a combination of factors. What are these factors? Their feelings about their families, material support to them, and the quality of care that they receive. And so it's not, so you see how complex it is. Similarly, some children of migrants don't consider themselves left behind. When they have close relationship with their caregivers and they feel supported, they seem to be okay. Now, in a similar vein, Liu also argues that it's not separation per se from the family, from the parents, but the stability and the quality of care that they receive that is critical for the emotional well-being of children. Now, in this context, the doubly left behind children are the worst off. So, again, Rachel Murphy has coined this term doubly left behind children. Who are doubly left behind children? Doubly left behind children are those children who suffer both material deprivation and care deficits. And so these children see themselves as having been put to one side within their families with no one to help them, while also being excluded from possibilities of a good life, usually because they have limited chances for educational progression and so on. Right. Now, let's look at the unit of the household and the family, right? So, but before that, very quickly, what is the difference between the household and the family? So, very simply, the definition of household is based on a shared residence, right? So, a sociological definition might entail members who live together in one residence and who eat food from a common kitchen, or around the concept of commensality, right? And this is the definition which is largely used in household surveys. What is the family? How is the family different from the household? The family, on the other hand, is based on a kinship unit. The kinship unit could be through blood, marriage, adoption, or even fictive kin, where you may not be related to someone by blood or marriage, but there would be close emotional and social bonds that they perform the function of the family. Now, in regions of high migration, so now you can see then, now if there are migrant members involved, a household can be considered as a split household that's split into various places, or a multi-locational households. Very strictly speaking, if we follow the definition of the household, then you actually have multiple households, right? The place where the migrants are is one household, or the place where the migrant is one household, which is different from the source household, right? And similarly, in the literature, there's the concept of shared family, there's the concept of linked family, and so on. And in the context of migration, you can also see how the household, which is in the source region, is largely immobile, and the migrant members are largely mobile. So you have the idea of an immobile household in the source region and mobile migrant members in destination regions, and how the two go hand in hand, right? Again, think of the social cost of such an arrangement, right? Okay, so now let us come to the point about migration as a household strategy. And so it's a household strategy, it's a household livelihood strategy, it's also a family strategy. Again, think of all of these and the implications and the social cost of migration because of these kinds of arrangements, right? So, what is also evident in the literature is that there is now a fair bit of critique that has emerged of the remittance based model of development, right? And why is that? Now, this is largely because, the migration project and the family project are in tension with one another increasingly. Why is that? Because migration increasingly is for the family, right? Migration fundamentally is for the family. But if it destabilizes family life so much, if the social costs of migration are so high, then is it even worth it? Is the risk of migration even worth it? Now, in a study in rural Indonesia, where there have been 2 generations of female migration, Somaya et al. Find that young women, particularly those women who were left behind as children, they assert themselves and exercise their agency as adults by actively choosing to stay and not migrate. And why do they not migrate? Because the pain and family separation of migration is seen as excessively burdensome for 2 successive generations to endure. And so these women, these women who now have children of their own, these women, when they were children themselves, they were beneficiaries of their parents' hard work, sacrifice, their remittances, which enabled them to get an education, allowed them to access respectable jobs, and this they feel is enough. And this they feel is enough. They don't wish to migrate themselves. They don't wish that their family members migrate. And so therefore, an alternative pathway to excessive migration and development allows them to combine work and care, and most importantly, proximate family life. And this is the kind of resistance that helps them redress the history of absent family life in their own case, right? Now, in a similar vein, Lam and Yeo argue, based on their study of left behind children in Indonesia and Philippines, they say that children and young people express a strong desire for their family to stay together, regardless of their economic situation. And therefore, they don't understand or they don't fully appreciate the necessity of family separation as a livelihood strategy. So, you see, it's very important to have perspectives of children, of young people in understanding the household and the family, which is often not done. And once we do that, then the social costs of migration also then amplify. Right. What about youth in migration? Now, in the literature, you can see very clearly that migration is seen as a rite of passage for young people. Globally, across various contexts in the global south, in Latin America, in Asia, in India. So, Samantha Punch's work on youth and migration is seminal, and I advise all of you who are interested in understanding youth migrations, look up this work. And so, when we do this, what is the context of migration? That is fundamentally important to understand, right? So, when you're talking about young people, now in the source region, very often at some point, migrants drop out from school. They drop out and run away from school. Now, that's a very common theme, right? And so, therefore, is it a push of some kind? Is it a pull towards the city? So, that is again fundamentally important to understand the costs of migration. What is the context in which young people's migration is occurring? And it's very closely linked with education and schooling. The second part is about work and employment, right? So, when young people migrate, what is the source area context of work and employment? Is there available employment? Are there appropriate jobs? Increasingly, in many settings, in many contexts, in many regions in the global south, you have a rural source region that does not have appropriate employment opportunities. So, and young people don't want to work in agriculture. That's a fact, that's something that we see very commonly in a lot of studies. So, therefore, they want to escape the rural, they want to escape agriculture, and so they go to the cities. So again, the context matters in the source region as well as in the destination regions, right? So young people also largely migrate through social networks. They have huge aspirations, and mobility is a fundamental part of young people's aspirations. And the destination region gives us a lens to that, right? Then again, you have a structural context in the destination region, which is the overarching context of labor demand, right? And migration then, therefore, is a response. It's a response to the functional demands of capitalism at destination regions. And this is something in both source and destination regions are therefore tied together. You have a supply of labor in source regions, and you might have not enough appropriate work for young people who are mobile, who can be very mobile. Youth and mobility often go hand in hand. And at the same time, you have a demand at destination region of specific kinds of labor. And the other thing that you need to keep in mind is that migration is also associated with life cycle, right? So while mobility and the desire, and not only the desire, while mobility and the aspiration and the desire to migrate might be high when you are young, but once people have children, once they have families, you have several studies that show that people don't wish to migrate anymore. They wish to remain in the source region. And then, and that has to do with family life and so on, because often it's not possible to take family members, especially your spouse and children, with you when you migrate. So therefore, life cycle, generation, these are also very important concepts to think about when we're talking of the social costs of migration, specifically when we're looking at young people and their migration, right? The other thing is agriculture. A lot of source regions still continue to have agriculture. Households cultivate, they cultivate for food security, they cultivate because it's a part of their identity, and farming and agriculture are fundamental features of life in the greater part of the global south. Now, young people with increasing education, there is some evidence that they're averse to work in agriculture, but as they grow older, it's also clear that the relationship with agriculture is more complex, and very often, because agriculture is associated with food security, because agriculture is associated with an identity, and in one's life course, in middle age, people do work in, the likelihood of people working in agriculture is much higher if they're older, right? So people who might be averse to working in agriculture at a younger age, as they grow older, might not be as averse or are open to working in agriculture because of a whole host of situations, right? So therefore, when we think of migration, we also need to look at people's relationship with agriculture at the level of the individual, at the level of the family, and at the level of the household. We now come to structural inequalities, and we look at specifically at source and destination areas in this slide. Now, you have migration, which has become the norm, it has been normalized, and it's a functional demand of neoliberal capitalism, right? And it is within this context then, there are several costs of migration that have to do with this structural reality, right? And so the first is that the state's development process intersects with capitalism, and this explains the circularity of migration. The reason that people are often unable to settle down in destination, right? This has to do with barriers to mobility. Now, in international migration, you have laws, you have visa rules, you have barriers to immigration. Similarly, in internal migration, migrants often earn very low incomes in destination regions. You have exclusionary processes of urbanization. And so, in both internal and international migration, a majority of migrants must be separated from their families, and their family settlement is not possible due to economic, institutional, and structural reasons, And it is these structural realities that are so embedded in our system at the global level, at the national level, and at the local level, that these structural realities pass on from one generation to the next as rural areas and source countries, source regions bear the cost of production and reproduction of an urban labor force, thus deepening the gap between rural and urban life. So that's also a fact, you know, economic theory will tell you that no, rural and urban will converge over time. But given the structural realities of our development process, very often you have a situation, especially manifested by migration, that shows that there is a divergence between rural and urban areas. So therefore, the fact that migration is the norm, it's normalized as a functional demand of neoliberal capitalism, has huge social costs in source regions, in destination regions, and specifically highlighting the divergence between rural and urban life. And then the fundamental question to ask here is who is benefiting from this migration and who is paying its cost? Right. I want to take you through another example of structural inequalities and migration, right? So, migration outcomes, migration experiences, they're all mediated by caste, mediated by class, mediated by other markers of social differentiation. These are not homogeneous outcomes and homogeneous experiences because of migration. Where you are in the social order have a huge role to play in what your migration outcomes and experiences are, right? So, now there's a fascinating paper by Diana Mata Kodesal and its title, Is it simpler to leave or to stay put? Desired immobility in a Mexican village, right? So now Mata Kodesal shows in the context of rural Mexico, it is the less educated and poorer folks who have to pursue irregular migration to the US, even though they don't aspire to do so. While the more educated can access local jobs due to their education and skills, it's the less educated who cannot access these local jobs and then they must migrate. So, now here's a quote in this paper from a 47-year-old school teacher with no migration experience. And I quote, when villagers, for instance, have no land, not a single plot, have no house, I think it is easier for them to leave. Because otherwise, they have nothing here. Although they have their memories here, their ancestors, they have everything else here, but they need to feed their bodies. So they decide to leave and try better. In that case, yes, it is easier for them to leave, even though it is a very hard thing to do. So now you see, this is a 47-year-old school teacher. When asked who migrates in the village, this is his response. So again, you know, you see how qualitative research gives us insights on how it is easy to leave, but it's a hard thing to do. And now this kind of nuance is difficult to obtain in quantitative research, where experiences are not really studied, and when studied, hard and easy can be used as binary variables constructed in opposite to one another. But you can see here from this very, very poignant example that even something as migration can be very hard and very easy, and the paradox makes complete sense, right? Now, let me come to the second quote. Now, the second quote is by a 31-year-old male who in his youth migrated irregularly to the US, to New York City, and when asked why he decided to migrate, he says, and I quote, because unfortunately, the countryside in Mexico is neglected. The government does not support it. It is not as supportive as other countries are. So we cannot get ahead from working in the fields as much as we would like to, or at least as much as other people can with their jobs. So I needed to have my own stuff, and I didn't find other way than going to the other side, to the US. So the researcher then asks, when you say what your stuff, what do you mean? And he responds, my fields, my house, my car, what everyone aims to have, isn't it? A home, something to move around, to live more comfortably. Now, you see the second respondent, he comes from a family of peasants, and he was certain that locally agriculture would not have allowed him to achieve the minimum material levels of comfort he deemed as acceptable. So therefore, Mata Kodasal argues that aspirations for an acceptable level of living, they strongly influence your decision to migrate. And she argues that the expectations or desire to migrate arise when people perceive that locally they cannot achieve specific levels of comfort, and mobility is the only way or the most convenient way to achieve higher standards of living in the village. So therefore, even when people desire immobility, they migrate because migration is seen necessary for what is an acceptable, good life, right? And really then, Mata Kodasal argues that mobility, both national and international, is sort of, features as a means to achieve permanence in the village, and migration is viewed as a means to an end, enabling and being able to live a good life locally. Now, I don't have much time to go on to castes, but I want to tell you that, through the course of this course also you have seen, again, what caste one belongs to has a fundamental role to play, whether or not one migrates, what kind of work one is doing at destination, and it sort of, it very, very clearly emerges from the research which is being done that it is largely the upper castes that are able to migrate for work in occupations that pay higher incomes, whereas those at the lowest rung of the economic ladder, the Dalits and Adivasis, are the worst off at destination. They are part of the most precarious short-term migration streams. They earn the lowest income and have the poorest conditions of work, and they live in the harshest circumstances. So therefore, social and economic hierarchies in the source region, precarities in the source region are also reproduced at destination, and therefore there is scant evidence that spatial mobility is associated with social mobility in many contexts. Now let's look at the costs versus benefits of migration. Now, largely a main theme that emerges is that family separation is necessary, households must endure it for higher incomes or for their own survival through migration. So, I'll just take you through two very interesting but not surprising results from empirical research. So, in the context of my own research in Bihar, I find that in a study which was undertaken in 2016, 98% of the returned migrants reported that they found migration beneficial, yet 9 in 10 did not desire to migrate permanently, right? And so what is the context? The context is that yes, income from migration may be more stable, relatively higher than what may have been in the source region, but the higher income, the material gains of migration come at a high cost of separation from family members. So therefore, it's a little surprise that while 98% of the returned migrants reported that migration was beneficial, 9 in 10 did not desire to migrate permanently. Now, in a similar vein, in China too, there's work by Ye which shows that peasant migrants prefer not to migrate. They desire to live with their families in rural areas. And these sentiments also resonate with Diane Mata Kodasal's work that I just took you through. And in rural Mexico, where none of our research participants in the qualitative study considered migration to be good in itself. So then the fundamental question really is that, so you have all of these costs of migration. How can policies address social costs of migration? We don't really have policies at the national level, policies at the global level, And actually the fundamental question is not even how can. Also think of, can policies address the social cost of migration? So with that, we come to the end of this lecture on the social cost of migration. So we looked at several things. The first thing that we looked at was, so this was a wide-ranging lecture, right? Looking largely at the impacts of migration, and then I want you to think about what the social costs of migration could be because of these impacts of migration. Not only the impacts of migration, but also how migration is organized structurally, right? So we looked at the various streams of migration, internal, international, and also looked at the various units of analysis. So starting from the individual to the household and the family, to the community, to the village, and to the nation state, and at the global level, right? What are the social costs of migration at each unit of analysis is something that we very briefly discussed. Then we looked at the impact of migration on women who were left behind, had a very little discussion on gendered migration. We then looked at children and migration, which is often not looked at in migration research, and if you look at the impact of migration on children, then the social costs really become quite evident. We then discussed the impact of migration on the household and the family, followed by a discussion on youth and migration. Specifically related to youth and migration, we also discussed gender, generation, life cycle, a little bit about agriculture, and we then looked at structural inequalities in source and destination areas of class and caste, all of which then have to do with the social cost of migration. And then we looked at the cost versus benefits. And when we think of the cost versus benefits, I also want you to think about who are the winners of this arrangement, who are the losers of this arrangement, and then therefore also the social costs of migration for different categories of people. With that, we come to the end of this lecture, and because this was a wide-ranging lecture, the reading list is also pretty long, and for those of you who are specifically interested in this, you're most welcome to engage with these readings more deeply. Thank you very much.